Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Heemstra. I'm a composer and violist, and I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening or afternoon if you're on the West Coast for the Association of Canadian Women Composers, our 40th anniversary event. We are doing a panel entitled Beginnings, looking at the history of this wonderful organization and the history of Canadian women composers as a whole. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists and my fellow leader, Diane, as well. So Diane, if you can say a few words, and then we'll jump in with our panelists.
I think Emily has said it. This is the first of our events, and as the year progresses, I'm hoping that there will be more. Well, there'll be concerts, live streamed. There's lots going on the anniversary page, and if we were having a conference, a panel is something we would do. So that was one of the reasons for doing this. And thank you to Emily and Amanda Lowry, who really helped put it together. And thank you to our panelists. And I'm looking forward to hearing all of this. I'll pass it back to Emily.
Thanks, Diane. Elaine, would you say a few words about yourself as we get started?
I am not a composer, but I am a historian, and I've taken a very keen interest in Canadian music because I started writing in that area, and then I was hired at Carleton University to specifically teach Canadian music courses. And along with that, I had become very much involved as a performer, playing works by Canadian composers, which I enjoyed doing very, very much. So I've had close contacts with a range of Canadian composers, but I've particularly have had an interest in the background of Canadian women composers. And tonight I'm going to just say a little bit about some of the early pioneers that we have had in Canada that may not be that well known to others.
That was a wonderful intro, Elaine. Thanks so much. Carolyn, would you say a few words about yourself?
Yes, I was a composer. Hi, Kai. I was a composer. I studied with Sam Dolan and Gordon Delamont, and expected to have a life as a composer and as a professional musician. And life throws funny things at you sometimes, and I did a million other things, but not that. So I haven't been working as a musician and composer for a number of years, probably since the late 90s. At the beginning, it was when I wanted to conduct, I sent out a lot of applications to a lot of schools, universities, conducting schools, and I got very polite letters back that said, "We do not accept lady conductors." And that was true every time I sent out a letter and asked, "Please, may I come and study?" No women allowed. The women who were colleagues of mine, peers of mine studying composition, were not getting performances. They wrote, they struggled, they were passionate, but they didn't market their work. They didn't tug on music directors' sleeves, and so from a number of vantage points, I was an arts officer at the Ministry of Culture and Recreation in the late 70s, early 80s, and so it just seemed that women weren't getting the opportunities that they needed. And it was frustrating. And it was, the old, who do you think you are? Why do you think you should be able to do this? Women don't, I was told actually, women don't write music. And even if they did, it wouldn't be good enough to perform. So there was, I know that wasn't the case with the League. There were a few women at the League. There were a few women at the CMC, but not many. Anyway. When you tell me that I can't do something, that's big trouble. So I stood up on my hind legs and I did something about it.
Well, we can't wait to hear, Carolyn, about what went into your decisions and your reasoning and what the initial days were like for ACWC. Alma, I'd love just to give you a quick chance before we dive in, just to introduce yourself as well.
Okay, I'm a composer. I also am an engraver. And now that Caroline mentioned conducting, I was the top student in Victor Feldbrill's class. And the second person was Hermano Florio. And we had to come up with a deal. I got 93 and he got 91. And so he was very honest with me in saying, it's hard. It's going to be hard. But Hermano has already scholarship lined up in Italy. And it wouldn't make me any less of a conductor if we switched marks. And I figured, 2 marks up, 2 marks down. I'm in the 90s out of a very large class. And sure, I don't care. But it bothered me. I know when I took the stand for the Estonian orchestra, when the conductor was late, they thought it was a joke. I didn't find it funny. And I worked these guys. They tried to switch music. And I said, no, I knew all the orchestra members. I played all the instruments. You couldn't put it past me. And it was kind of fun now being conductor. Like, let's see if the guys can do that. And I egged Victor on. It wasn't easy, but I didn't let these guys get away with anything either. Especially when you have to stand up for yourself and you have to do it nicely. But as a composer, it's difficult. As an engraver, I started off with the same difficulties. A woman handling my music, I mean, really. So I worked under a male name and, they couldn't tell. I actually used my father's name. Albert Miller, who was ornery, difficult, made lots of mistakes, didn't like dealing with composers, always said, well, why don't you talk to my secretary? That would be me. And, and they liked that. I couldn't believe it. And he said, you should get a raise. I said, I just can't do that. He said, yeah, no, I'm just telling that next guy, we're just adding some more money on that. And they accepted it. I couldn't believe it. And so I thought, this is going to do very well. Does he want to cut? And but it was because I didn't go into physics that I decided to change my profession and go into music. He withdrew all support. Then I said, I'm still going to do it. And so therefore, that's why he had to be there and, do the work and get the jobs. But in composition, every step of the way, I had to needle performers. And then I went to the top, Ezra Shabas. And you start to change the rules. How can you graduate out of university without having heard your own music? How can the performer graduate without having played it? So, things started to change, but it was early days. So, but well, I think that's about enough, I'm going to say for now.
That was a wonderful introduction. Maybe for some of the newer ACWC members like myself, Elaine, would you mind setting the scene for us? What was it like for composers, for women composers, before ACWC was founded? Could you give us a little insight into that?
Well, I'm going to go way, way back because here in Canada, I don't know how many of you know that the first music theory treatise of North America was written by a woman in 1718. And she was a member of the Augustinian order in Quebec City. Mère Marie-André Reina de Plessis. And her treatise is very interesting because she talks about the fact that in her order, women had to compose music. They had to learn how to conduct it. They had to be familiar with all the instruments and the voices that were being used. But the thing is that she was a member of an order. And in Quebec, the only place that women could get instruction in composition was by becoming a nun until the late 20th century. That was the only avenue available for them. because just as Alma says, there was that idea that women could not compose music. Why would they bother? But we have, a few examples in our Canadian history. But I think the publication of the Canada Union Waltz that came out in 1840, the composer is given as by a Canadian lady, because a woman was not allowed to put her name on a composition. We have a good idea. We think we know who it is. Another woman who was of an upper class in Quebec City and was apparently a very fine musician. But that was the attitude. And I think that for me, the most outstanding woman composer to come along and really sort of stir things up, shall we say, was Susie Frances Harrison, who was born in Toronto in 1859. She went to Montreal for finishing school and became fascinated with the culture that she found in Quebec. And French Canadian culture influenced her a lot, both in her compositions and in her writings, because she was also well known as an author. And in fact, she is now considered one of the secondary members of the Confederation Writers of Canada. But she moved back to Toronto, and from 1902 to 1922, she was principal of the Rosedale branch of what was then the Toronto Conservatory of Music. And on the 18th of April, 1902, she had a full concert of her compositions performed at the conservatory. And that included selections from her opera, Pependor. She had written several works for the greeting of the new Governor General in Ottawa. She wrote a lot of songs, many of them under pseudonym. She used both in her prose writing and in her composition, she often would use pseudonyms, but she did have some compositions published under her own name. Unfortunately, we have lost a lot of her works, but she even wrote for the string quartet. So this was in the early 1900s. So she often talks about how difficult it was to have publishers believe in her. And she made numerous trips to New York City and to London, England, trying to get publishers for her works. And she said they just would laugh at her. And I think that was probably one of the reasons we had so many women composers. They wanted to compose, and they were also usually music teachers. So we have a number of women who became very noted for their pedagogical works in the early 20th century, among them Kate Chittenden, Hope Camera, Leila Fletcher. Leila Fletcher's books are still around being used. But I think that put a marker on Canadian women composers, that the only thing that they could do was to write pedagogical works. And I actually have heard male composers say this about women composers in the 1960s. So they had got this label put upon them. And it, of course, was very difficult to break away from that. And as Carolyn has already mentioned, there were a few women in the Canadian League of Composers and who had become members of the Canadian Music Centre. And of course, we have these three wonderful women, Jean Coulthard, born in 1908, Barbara Pentland, born in 1912, Violet Archer, born in 1913. And they were determined to be composers. But they had difficulties. Like when Jean Coulthard said that she went to England to study with Vaughan Williams, she said he was more interested in what she was wearing than in teaching her composition. So this was the the attitude. And it was only when Jean Coulthard had a chance to work with Arthur Benjamin. Arthur Benjamin actually encouraged her in the early 1940s to write for the orchestra. And she, of course, subsequently in 1963 wrote her wonderful concerto for piano and orchestra. But it took her quite a while to get to that stage that she had enough confidence to write in the larger forms. Similarly with Barbara Pentland, of course, she had a lot of barriers put in her way because her fairly well-off family in Winnipeg didn't think a woman should be interested in music and be composing. But she, of course, went off to Juilliard to study. And, but again, like Jean Coulthard, a lot of the works of Barbara Pentland are pedagogical works. And it's a similar case with Violet Archer. And so the label continued to a degree, even though these three wonderful women composed in larger forms. And I think that's what Carolyn was getting at. It was so difficult for women to be considered genuine composers, able to write in the larger forms. And something had to be done about it.
Wow, that is really amazing to hear. Yeah, it just seems remarkable that women were just classified as writing only pedagogical works. When did you find, Elaine, when historically does it seem that that starts to change? Because you said that's even into the 1960s, or maybe.
Yes, I would say, well, you still find a lot of women that will concentrate in doing pedagogical works, and they often do them very well. But I think that gradually, I would say probably more in the 1980s, 1990s, that was when some of Jean Coulthard's orchestral works started to be considered sort of standard repertoire, shall we say, for Canadian orchestras to use. I mean, the Toronto Symphony would have Jean Coulthard write works for their tours in Asia. And then we have younger composers like Alexina Louis coming along, and they were, you know, recognized as being the most performed Canadian composer around the world for several years. So that started to change the attitudes, I think. But a lot of hard work had to go into that finally becoming the reality, and it's still there are barriers out there.
Maybe Alma and Carolyn, would you mind weighing in on that? Did you find as you were writing in this in the 60s and 70s, did you find that your music was classified in that pedagogical area?
Well, in the 1970s, I mean, when I started thinking about doing something to promote Canadian women composers was 1978, 1979. Women were not being performed. Just shortly after I started the ACWC in 1980, the Toronto Symphony Orchestra had not performed a work by a woman composer in 35 years. And they programmed an overture by Violet Archer to go at the beginning of a program for one concert, and Walter, oh good grief, his name just went out of my head. He hated me. I kept pulling on.
Siskind?
No.
Or
Walter, Homburger, the director, the administrator, the manager of the Toronto Symphony at the time. He was so fed up with me because I kept hounding him, and they finally played this overture, or programmed it and performed it. And he told me that they put a little overture at the beginning of the program so that patrons could wait until it was over before they came to take their seats. You know, so it would be easy to miss because they knew they wouldn't like this work. It was so maddening. It was just crazy making. So if you don't mind, I'm going to show you the poster of the first concert. I was, as I said, I was an arts officer at the Ministry of Culture and Recreation. So I sat ex officio on the board of Orchestra Canada and Orchestra Ontario and the Ontario Choral Federation and all of these umbrella organizations. And anyway, what was I going to tell you? So I had a pretty good feel of what was happening or not happening with women in music in Canada. And I took a proposal to David Yeager, and bless his heart, he's responsible for all this. I took a proposal to do a concert of Canadian women composers to him. You know, to tell you the truth, I'd been a musician for a lot of years. I had no clue what I was doing when I took that proposal to him. And to his great credit or foolishness, he said, there's your desk over there. He loved the proposal. And so this is what came of it. 2 concerts, 1979. And this is what the poster looked like. Can you see that? Canadian women composers. And the composers were Christy Alec, Violet Archer, Norma Beecroft, Maggie Burston, Jean Coulthard, Mary Gardner, Larissa Kuzmenko, Alexina Louie, Kai Marshall, Diana McIntosh, Barbara Pentland, and Anne Southam, and a bunch of women performers listed under that. And it was at the Pauline McGibbon Cultural Center on Lombard Street. It was the old morgue that had been renovated for a women's cultural center. And it was just gorgeous, fantastic acoustics. And it was packed for these concerts of women composers. So this was let me just put this down for a second. And this was the program that looked like this, Canadian Women Composers, Pauline McGibbon Cultural Center. So that was the first. And then those 2 concerts, I co-hosted with Warren Davis at the CBC 2 programs based on those 2 concerts. So we pulled out the best performances and fit them into 2 shows. So I just wanted to, do you remember Bill Littler? Elaine, you'll remember Bill Littler at the Star. He was a big fan of Canadian women composers. I'm just going to read you a tiny bit of what he said after that concert. On October the 15th, 1979, it has been suggested that on a per capita basis, Canada has more women writing music than any other country. After this weekend's pair of concerts by Canadian women composers at the Pauline McGibbon Cultural Center, I am prepared to believe it. Thanks to the organizational energy of Carolyn Lomax and the sponsorship of CBC Radio, no fewer than a dozen members of what used to be called the fair sex had their music performed. Granted, not many of these women qualify as household names. And then he goes on, and at the end he says, maybe it is encouragement enough that so many women are now writing music. If greatness didn't rear its head over the weekend, craft definitely did. The pieces all deserved a hearing, several deserve a second, and these women have more to offer. Still, it would be nice to think that one day they won't have to be singled out this way and championed because of their sex, as they have for so long been discouraged because of it. So I thought that kind of encapsulated what we've been fighting about.
Yeah, that's quite a statement.
Yeah, it was. I was so happy with that column because it got some attention for what I was trying to do. And Ulla Tallgrass, remember Ulla and Music Magazine? Well, in this issue that cost a whole $1.50, I wrote this. Anne, Norma Beecroft, Alexina Louie, and Maggie. And the headline is Women Composers Band Together. That was Ulla's headline, not mine. So that gave us a little bit more attention, which was very nice. And this article was in Toronto Calendar magazine, which is gone now, but it was Composers Lib, how women composers were starting to make a name. And that was from that was September 1981. So I don't want to hog the time. Emily,
no, that was wonderful. That's to see those concert programs is a pretty remarkable thing. I would love maybe Alma, if you could share some of your experience. I know you mentioned that a little bit in your introduction, but could you share with us a little bit more about your experience? Maybe even before school, what drew you into composition and what you felt like the environment was like as you headed into school?
Well, composition in the early days. Okay, that would be like 1974, 75. That was my first year of composition with Walter Buczynski. And when he saw me in the class, all he could say is, well, so you survived or you made it. But getting performances was hard. I wrote a piece and for voice and piano, and I tried the conservatory. I tried everywhere to get anybody to do the vocal part. And then I asked my clarinet accompanist, Elaine Keeler, I'm having trouble getting a performer. And she said, you know, I can play that. And I told her also that I just can't get anyone to do the vocal part. Well, if Harry Summers can do it, you can do it. Not sure who Harry Summers was at the time, but I thought, well, probably a student or something. And okay, well, if he can do it, I could do it. And so we did it. But every piece had to be fought like that. Every work that I had to have performed at the University of Toronto, everything needed, how do I get the performers? When I did my master's degree, that was really hard. I told Victor Feldbrell, you know, I need an orchestra. He said, right, you want to hear your master's thesis? Makes sense. So he put on his door, this is a sign up for a performance of Elma's new piece. These are the people we need. Rehearsal will be on Thursday in 0023. Be there. And he's, you know, when you get a conductor doing that and it's on his door, he was there. And I said, I wanted a recording. So I told Dennis Patrick, and he was there. No audience or anything, but I just needed to hear this big piece. And so, you know, everything had to be through a lot of perseverance. But I was really amazed that in a day, all my friends who, since I played clarinet, they all signed up. All the strings were there, all the woodwinds, of course. I knew everybody. And that was the big plus in being a clarinet player. Everywhere I replaced people, and I also got into trouble a few times, but you know, it was worth it. I felt it was worth it because I needed to hear the music. I needed to learn how to play the instruments. And where else do you do it if you don't do it at university? So it had to be a lot of courage. You had to go into the dean's office and say, I want to hear my music. I had to go into the performance head department. I would be Professor Shabas and say, look, I need 3 percussion. And he said, right. And he lorded over them and he said, okay, 3, and he would show up at the rehearsal. So my goodness, if you weren't there and the head of the performance department is there, I have no sympathy. I had to hear my piece. And I was there. I was always there, extra parts, everything. But yeah, then the men started to notice, how come Elma gets all these performances? And I said, well, because you're over 6 foot tall and you don't have any more effort to do it. So you're on your own. I didn't have much sympathy. And so I was the only woman too. So I don't know how much sympathy they gave me anyway. But, I felt that, they could go and complain, do your work and do your homework. And so that was the way I had to be going through school between 1974 to 77 when I graduated. And then I did my master's in 78. And I did it in 1 year. I wanted to get out of there. I did it in 10 months. And I did everything, took every course possible. And I was out of there with a 2-hour oral exam. They could ask me anything they wanted. The men, I don't know, they 20 minutes. But then, you have to plan it.
It's incredible to think that that was the case. I mean, that's
Yeah.
30 years ago even.
Yeah,
It's
amazing.
remarkable
Yeah.
that-
But then you have to think
Mhm.
of it. If I'm going to be talking in that room and all my competitors out there in the cold in the hall outside the dean's office, well, I took my time. I gave examples. I did a tour when he asked me about the question on romantic music. Well, I covered every country, but one is to do the nationalism. And of course, and my husband said, they're going to ask you the last letter of the alphabet in the Harvard Dictionary, the Zarzuela. I didn't believe it at first. He said, oh no, they're going to ask you that. He's been a prof for 9 years, he knows. So I got help at home, at least, where I could, practice. I practiced with Elaine, and I even practiced with John Beckwith, who was on my side to get me through this. And I could identify scores. I was very score oriented since I did a lot of engraving. So that helped. But, you do your little bit, you do your homework, and you do the little bit of competition too. It didn't hurt. But no, it wasn't
Be
easy.
brave, Alma, as you were, I think. I think you have to be brave. That's what I found when I was researching on the Canada Council grant, like you, talking to women across the country. They worked really hard to compose, and but they didn't take the next step often, as you did, going out and finding performers or asking for help. But I found that a lot of women didn't have the networks. They knew other women who were composing, but they didn't know what the orchestras were interested in, or what might be commissioned, or they weren't pulling on sleeves and saying, will you look at this, or will you give this a reading? And so that was one of the motivators for me, because I was talking to a lot of women like Alma, who were saying, no one's interested, no one wants to hear my work. So that's why I thought that if there were not just one of us, but a lot of us saying somebody's going to pay attention, that we'd have more power. Victor,
Carolyn, would you mind sharing with us what the initial response was from the broader music community and from composers when ACWC was founded as the founding member?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. It was really mixed. It was hostile. Sometimes it was, actually, I pulled out a quote from Victor Davies. You all probably know Victor, lovely guy. This was March of 1981, and I just come back from going across the country doing the Canada Council research. And so this was an article in Orchestra Canada from March of 1981, Association of Canadian Women Composers. We got a front page in Orchestra Canada, which was nice. And Victor said, Orchestra Canada spoke to Victor Davies, chairman of the umbrella organization, the Canadian League of Composers, for his thoughts on the establishment of a separate association for women composers. He responded with a clarification that membership in the ACWC did not preclude membership in the League. for women already in the CLC, and that the League will continue to represent the concerns of its entire membership, addressing issues such as composer commissions, briefs to government, etc. However, in recognition of the present needs of women composers for additional avenues of support, he noted the specialized role which the ACWC would, in his view, better carry out. That of addressing those needs and concerns, not merely, he specified, of the working woman, but particularly of the creative working woman with the added demands which that career imposes. Expressing his support, as well as contemplating the perspective of this new venture, Mr. Davies said, "I don't think there has been any discrimination against women composers, but I think that the Association of Canadian Women Composers may now be able to provide the added mutual support and profile to women composers which the League cannot give. It is perhaps in the intangible issue of raising the profile of women in the field to public and peers alike where the ACWC will most likely affect the best results." So that was from March of 1981. And I think that's, I mean, Victor was very generous. Not everyone was so generous. You know, it was an organization for women composers. And so it was told to me that we were diluting the work of the League and undermining the CMC, not by Victor, but by others, you know, that why aren't we all together doing this thing? Why aren't you part of, why don't women want to be part of the League? And of course, women did want to be part of the League, but they often were not invited to be part of the League, you know, and it was like beating your head against a brick wall sometimes. And I think Pentland was a case in point, you know, everyone recognized how brilliant she was and how great the work was, but she could not get performances. She could not get recognition. You know, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I would love to hear, Elaine, your thoughts when the ACWC was founded. If you saw any changes in the broader music community, if you saw like what the timeline was of seeing change in Canadian women composers being more recognized within the broader music community.
Well, my experience was a little bit split because I was sort of living in two cities at that time. I was commuting between Toronto and Ottawa, of course. But I was in organizations concerned with contemporary music in Toronto, and that was where I worked a lot with Mary Gardner, to a certain extent with Anne Southam. And I would say in the early 1980s, after the organization had been founded, we were starting to see more, I think, more performances, more acceptance of compositions by larger organizations, I mean, larger performing organizations. So I wouldn't say it was a huge shift, but it was starting to move things, I think, the direction that we wanted it to move. And hopefully, you know, over the years that I think the association can look back on their 40 years and say that, yes, the association has accomplished a great deal for its members in that time period.
Yeah, just after we started, Elaine, just after, it would have been, I think, probably the spring of 82 or 83, Norma Beecroft had the first commission for a woman composer from the COC, which I thought was a major breakthrough at that time. I wanted to show you something else from 1982. In 1982, I organized a conference at the University of Guelph. It was called Women of Note. And this was the poster for it. my staff there. And the brochure, it was a weekend conference. I was going to tell you for the first two conferences at the Pauline McGibbon Center, tickets were at the exorbitant price of $5 each. I'm not sure how anyone afforded that, but how the times have changed. So this was the program for the Women of Note. And I'm just going to read you some of the special guests for that, that conference. The speakers were Violet Archer, Antonia Brico. You remember her? Conductor of the Denver Symphony. She came up here. She was in her 80s then, and she came up to speak to everybody. It was that was such a thrill. Billy Bridgman, who was manager of Comus Music, Ula Callgrass, Nancy Geocaris of PRO, Elaine Keeler, Madam, Karen Kieser, Sasha McInnes-Heyman, Henry Mutzers, who was the chief librarian at the CMC at the time, Ann Summers, Sharon Smith, and Betty Webster. And yeah, so here's a woman of note.
Do you mind sharing, Carolyn, what some of the early activities of the ACWC was or were involved in? I'm not sure my grammar there. Especially as I guess someone like myself, I was born in the 90s, so I was just before the cell phone generation, but it's hard to imagine what networking was like back in the 80s.
No computers, Emily. No computers, no iPhones, no texting, no Facebook. It was primitive. And that's another thing, right? You think about women talking to each other now. Everybody texts, everybody phones, everybody FaceTimes, everybody's on Zoom. Here we are. None of that existed. So it was 10 times as hard. Okay, so here's some of the things I did. I had a series of Sunday afternoon concerts at the University Women's Club. They were small. It was a small space, but it was beautiful, and we had full houses every Sunday for weeks. Donelda McGetchie was my entry to the University Women's Club, and that gave us a great audience. Women who and men who went out into the community and talked about the fantastic music that they heard. I mean, we had some of the best performers in town, and really wonderful works. I usually had about 3, maybe 4 works on a program. So that was the University Women's Club series. I did a series of 10 radio shows on CJRT. Are you all familiar with CJRT in Toronto? CJRT FM. Paul Robinson was there at the time. And I pitched the idea of doing a couple of programs, and they said, yes, fine, go and do 10. So I did 10 programs, 10 programs that featured each week the work of one Canadian woman composer. That was heady times. I did a series of concerts at University of Toronto Scarborough campus. I did a seminar in Ottawa for the Department of Communications. It was I wrote a speech. I've got it sitting on the bed behind me here. It was a walk down memory lane today when I pulled out my box full of ACWC stuff. And I received a letter at that time, just after the Guelph conference, a letter from a conductor, Erna Von Dale. I don't know whether any of you would recognize her name. She had the Kitchener-Waterloo Community Orchestra, and Ula Callgrass had talked to her, and she had talked with, I think, Ann Southam. And in the bottom half of her letter, she said, I fervently hope that you will be able to expand your resources for publicity for any future events, because she hadn't heard about the conference in time to attend. So she said, which brings me to a more positive point. Wow, bravo, and thank you for getting such a festival off the ground. I am more than impressed by your roster of distinguished and capable speakers and performers, not to mention thrilled by the thought of meeting the guest, the great Brico. So yeah, so I was really pleased to hear from a conductor. What else did I do? I don't know. It was nonstop, insane promotion and talking and begging and writing, and there were articles and concerts, and I don't know. I went broke trying to fund all this stuff, and thanks to Anne for helping out with the conference, and yeah, bailing me out from time to time with costs and performers, and yeah.
Sorry to cut you off, Carolyn.
No, it's okay.
I would love to hear from Elma, because you were, I don't know the exact dates when you were president of the ACWC, but it was in the 90s. I would love to hear, Elma, what your experience was as president. This is maybe a two-parter, how the concerts and what kind of things ACWC was putting on in the 90s, and then also how that transitioned to your work as an archivist as well.
Okay, in the 80s into 1991, I ran a concert series in Hamilton, 9 years, 5 concerts a year, funded by every level of government, and I played women composers. But at that time, trying to develop an audience in Hamilton, not a lot of people knew any Canadian composers, never mind women. And I think that was also a part of my development in that year, is to build up an audience. So, and I also had a radio series, a phone-in radio series. So you could phone in requests. And if I didn't like your request and say it, oh, come on, another man, can't you be a little more imaginative? I played every CD that the Canadian Music Center had, LPs at that time, everything. And in my program, I had lots of fun too. I would have programs. So what are the 10 worst pieces ever written? You know, so and I would give out prizes. You know, you get the complete Opus 31 by Anton von Webern, and so no one knew what that was, but and I would do Drop the Needle, and I almost got into trouble with CRTC because I did a sample of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So not a good idea, but no one guessed it, and so it was okay. My score, I couldn't give it away, still have it. But moving into the 1990s, okay, I joined the ACWC in, I think, 1982. But what not a lot of people know about, when you asked about me as an archivist, is that I joined the Estonian Women's University Organization in 1975. That is the oldest organization, academic organization of women in Estonia. It started in 1911. At that time, if women congregated, it was considered a criminal activity, and they had to do it all underground. This is just, and their premise was very simple. They wanted parity with men to study university level courses. They were very supportive of democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of speaking Estonian in a congregation when they met. This was not legal at the time. Even men's organizations developed in 1870 could only speak German. So that was and finally the individualism, the freedom of the individual. So when you start with an organization like that, they survived 2 world wars. And then in 1940, the Soviets cut everything down. No organizations, illegal to gather. Everything had to be thrown out. And many of the organizing members of the Women University Organization were sent to Siberia for their agitation and difficulties in not integrating into society. So women at that time studied in Finland, in St. Petersburg, and elsewhere. So the diaspora after 1940 had to happen outside of Estonia. But even in DP camps, the women's organization survived. And then it even grew bigger until 1988, when the agitation of all of the people everywhere, universities started to bring back their organizations, still under Soviet thumb, and they started to agitate a little bit more everyone. They started to bring back patriotic songs, and that's how the singing revolution occurred in 1989, August the 23rd. 2 million people stood hand in hand from Tallinn to Vilnius. And what is the Soviet going to do? You know, you can't arrest 2 million people. There were people from Canada who went, some of my friends, I thought they were crazy, but they went there with the biggest Canadian, Estonian flags and the CBC, this is before CNN, CBC was there. And so people put their lives at stake by surrounding TV towers and the newspaper. So when Mary Gardner asked me to join in 1982, it was not a stretch. The archivists outside the country kept them alive. Even a cup and saucer from the last free meeting, one woman had smuggled out of Estonia as an artifact of the last chance she got to meet people together, all her sorority members. There's 7 sororities, women's sororities, then they're now international. And the archivist is not on the official board, but the archivist holds the flame of the democratic concept, and so highlights those women who suffered, who went to the Gulag, into work labor camps, simply for being women, speaking out and supporting democracy. And that is still going on. 2 weeks ago, we had a Zoom meeting of the association, and the president, the Prime Minister of Canada is a woman now, first one. And the very first comment by the right-wing opposition said that she looked really nice, and the buttons on her jacket matched the eyes of her dog. This is the Prime Minister of Estonia being talked to like that by the opposition. It was played at our meeting just to show what we're still fighting. This was only a few weeks ago. And then, just because I was there too, they played a recording of an interview of one of the top women conductors, just newly employed at the State Opera, or was it the State Symphony? This young interviewer asks the conductor, how do women, you know, being on the podium, how do they handle their emotions? I couldn't believe, you know, we all laughed. We just couldn't believe it. But that's why we feel, and so when I entered into the ACWC, the archives at that time, women who died, where would their music go? You couldn't go into the Library Archives Canada because you weren't published. It couldn't go into the Canadian Music Centre, well, because you're not a member. And it took, so I decided, you know, maybe we should start to gather this. And Mary said, well, there's a few boxes at the CMC, and, you know, you should, now that you know how to drive, you can go there. I joined the League first. It was a purely political move. John Weinswag said, you know, try the League first, ACWC if you want to. And I thought, why not? And he said, well, you know, it is difficult. That I said, it isn't difficult. It doesn't take a long stretch to become a woman composer, and already I am a woman composer. So the organization made sense to me. And the other thing was getting into the Canadian Music Centre. Well, everybody was having a hard time then. It was a real bottleneck. And the year that I entered, 60 composers entered the Canadian Music Centre. So it is a fight between trying to be a legitimate Canadian composer And then you add that you're a woman. It wasn't easy, but I think the first step of camaraderie was having an association of support. Just like now, the sorority system that Estonia had has now brought up very many women in politics, people who were at first shunned by the university. Now they are in politics heading the country. So
That's really remarkable.
yeah, it's crazy good, but yeah.
I'd love to hear.
Sorry, Emily, I wanted to ask Elma what radio station she did the programs on.
CFMU FM. It was community radio station, and my music, the program was called Music in the Shape of a Pear.
What
And
city were you in?
well, I did a lot of Canadian music, but then I inserted.
What city were you in Toronto?
Hamilton.
Oh, in Hamilton. Okay.
Yeah. And that went on for about 8 years.
Okay.
And we had I didn't know I had an audience until I went to a workout class, and one of the children of the people there said, "Oh my God, you're Elma Miller." And she listened to Music in the Shape of a Pear, and she told me that students subversively listened to it, and Paul Rappaport said it was required listening. So I had guests on, like had Boris Broad on, I had Dennis O'Driscoll on, who was a blind organist. I had anybody who wanted to be on. I had the Gabriele Erasmi, who taught romantic languages, a fanatic for Verdi, had his own show, but I had him on to talk about the politics of Verdi and how did that change Italy by having a composer write a hymn, the anthem that everybody can sing. Even I can sing it, but and we sang it at the faculty club, you know, a little bit too often probably, but there was a sympathy to women composers. There's the Citti Foundation in Italy. When I was president between 2004 and 2008, I rescued the ACWC. I was sort of parachuted in by Anne and Mary, and I started a membership list. I phoned everybody across the country. I typed them up, and then I retyped the Constitution, and it looked like I had done that in 1982, so I had to really just redo it this time on a computer, and fundraise and put the archives in place, take a course at the AAO, that's the Archives Association of Ontario. I wrote about the ACWC because I felt that we are the only composer association in Canada with an archive. The League doesn't have it. And so if you want to find out early parts of the League, you're going to have to do your own homework. I wanted to talk about Udo Gazemetz, who was an early immigrant to Canada, who was a composer in a displaced person camp in Geiselingen in 47, 46. I interviewed people who were at that camp. They're still alive in their 90s. And he was a part of the early part of the founding of the League in 1951. But
I'm so sorry to
sorry, I'm going on.
No, it's wonderful.
Yeah,
I find what you were saying about the Estonian League so fascinating, and to see how that ties in with your work as an archivist and just the legacy that those individuals carry on. We have less than 1 minute to unpack some really big questions at the very end. We will have a couple minutes for questions, but Elaine, I would love to leave this last question with you as a historian, and having seen the time before ACWC and all of the time in between. What do you hope for the future of ACWC, and what do you hope that women composers in 2021 can learn and benefit from? Those are big questions, I'm sorry.
It is a big question, but I think one of the most important thing is something that has come up several times this evening, and it's the importance of learning how to do one's own promotion. because I feel that we as women, we often feel we don't want to put ourselves forward or what we have produced. And I think that that is one of the major barriers for women composers to get over that hurdle and to learn how to network. And I think now, you know, we're talking about all the new communication tools that we have, and they have to learn how to use those to their best benefit. And I'm hopeful that through those means, we will learn much more about our women composers and the members of the organization.
We're waiting for Emily to come back. I want to thank all of you, everybody who's participating in this Zoom session tonight, because I had a dream back in 1979 that I could do something constructive to help women get their music played and to talk to other women and to make sure that the best of this creativity could happen in Canada. And I had to stop in around 1990, 91, because I was very ill at the time and I couldn't continue with the association. But it's been Anne and Mary and Elma and all of you and Carol Ann Weaver who have carried on and done the work and made it a success. And when I tell people about this organization now, I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. It's been, thank you from my heart.
Those are wonderful words, Carolyn. And again, my apologies. I had to tuck my 3-year-old back into bed.
No, never apologize for a 3-year-old.
We'll maybe just spend a couple minutes seeing if there's any questions from those that are listening to the live feed. So feel free to submit any questions now. And while we're waiting for them to come in, and you feel free to ask them to any panelists or just even topics in general about the ACWC. I just have a few announcements for upcoming events from for the 40th anniversary, and then also just events coming up within the ACWC. So there is a concert in Halifax of piano music on Monday, March 8th at 1 p.m. And it's for the International Women's Day. The Ensemble is doing their podcast on April 24th, not in March as planned. They'll be doing there's a concert in late May you can watch for the playlists as well that are coming out that Amanda Lowry has been so wonderfully curating. And there's also the deadline for the new works for solo viola competition call for scores has been extended to March 21st as well. Tell everyone that you know about the events page and share this with your friends. So I'm just going to take a quick look. I don't think we've had any questions come in, but I want to do a huge thank you to all of our panelists, to Elaine and Carolyn and Alma. A huge thank you to Diane and Carolyn as well for all their hard work in organizing this on the 40th anniversary committee. And thank you again to Amanda Lowry for all her tech support in setting up the Zoom. So thank you so much to everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank
My
you,
pleasure.
Emily. Well done. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.